Back in the 1980s, Stanley Bryant and his older brother Jeff ran one of the most powerful drug empires in the suburbs of Los Angeles, known on the streets as the Family, or the Bryant Family. At the top of that hierarchy was Jeff Bryant. What started off as a small crew had grown into a full-blown organization with around 150 to 200 people on the payroll. We're talking about an enterprise that, according to seized records, brought in over $1 million in just 3 months during 1988. That's the equivalent of over $2.7 million in 2025. The family operated out of multiple rock houses across the San Fernando Valley. They had a whole system in place. First, customers would go to Neighborhood Billiards, a pool hall on Van Nuys Boulevard owned by John Bryant. It looked like just another local hangout, but it was really a front. Customers would come in and then get told where to go to pick up their drugs. From there, they'd head to what was known as a count house. That's where they'd hand over the cash, which was then counted. The buyer would then get sent to another location for the drugs. After the deal was done, the person at the count house would log the details of the deal. Once the money at a location hit $1,000, the cash would be bundled and delivered to one of the main rock houses, specifically the one at 11442 Wheeler Avenue in Lakeview Terrace. Customers buying in bulk, like 9 ounces or more, didn't need to go to a count house. They would just drop by the Wheeler house, hand over the money, and get their drugs from there directly. Workers for the Bryant family had access to company cars. One of those cars, a small red Toyota, was used to deliver quarter-kilo drug orders to buyers. Workers even got paid vacations and were well paid, but they were also warned to stay low profile. No flashy outfits, and nothing that could draw unwanted attention from the police. Tuesdays were payday, and workers would swing by the Wheeler Avenue house to pick up their weekly paychecks. Stanley would sometimes show up to the house from time to time to give orders. At one point, Stanley, who everyone called Chief, held a meeting at the pool hall to announce some changes. The pool hall was shutting down. From now on, buyers would go to one house to drop off their money, get a slip of paper, and then head to a second house to pick up the drugs. To get the word out, workers were posted in 90-minute shifts at the pool hall to inform regulars of the new system. The Bryant family's rock houses weren't just ordinary crack houses. They were heavily fortified and secured. Most of the houses had reinforced steel grates and bars on the windows and doors. The entrances had metal gates with electronic locks and blackout screens that created something law enforcement referred to as Sally ports. They were basically traps that locked people between 2 locked metal gates so they couldn't see or access the rest of the house. Inside, reinforced locked doors blocked access between rooms. Between 1984 and 1985, LAPD hit several of these houses. Some raids were so intense they had to bring in an armored vehicle, like a military tank, to punch a hole in the wall just to get inside. On one raid, they had to pry open the front door. After they passed through it, they had to pass through another steel-grated door. On another, they had to dismantle an entire steel cage, which was installed at the front door just to get in. Once they had to use a battering ram to break through a bedroom wall. All the houses were practically empty. No food, no clothes, barely any furniture. But what cops did find during these raids were cocaine, cutting agents, and stacks of cash and tools used to cook crack. There were also several documents in the house, including payment books, inventory records, and drug ledgers officers called pays and owe sheets. On June 27, 1984, during a search of Jeff Bryant's home, officers stopped his car and searched it. Inside, they found a set of keys that led them straight to another rock house. Eventually, Jeff Bryant pled guilty to selling cocaine and operating a house where narcotics were sold. Stanley Bryant pled guilty to conspiracy, admitting he hired someone to sell cocaine out of the Wheeler Avenue house. But those arrests didn't slow the family down. Jeff might have been locked up, but he was still calling the shots from behind bars. And once Stanley got out, he took over the business on the streets. Any houses that were damaged during raids were fixed, refortified, and put right back into service. The family even hired locksmiths to upgrade the locks. Back in 1982, Stanley and Jeff hired a man named Armstrong to be the family's hitman. Reynard Goldman knew the Bryant brothers, and he used to buy coke from Jeff. But when he decided to get clean, he still owed Jeff around $50. It wasn't a huge amount, but Jeff didn't care. Reynard said he tried to pay him back but couldn't come up with the money. Jeff started accusing him of dodging him, and at one point reportedly told him to either pay up or get a gun. Roughly a week later, on April 23, 1982, Reynard was walking out of his house when Andre, who had been sitting out front, started shooting. Reynard was shot in the head and the arm, but miraculously he survived. After that, Reynard said people tied to the Bryant family started trying to intimidate him and pressure him to stay quiet and not testify. Around that same time, 3 other men, Ken Gentry, Michael Flowers, and G.T. Fisher, got into it with another Bryant brother, Roscoe. They claimed he sold them bad dope. When they demanded a refund, Roscoe refused, so the 3 of them decided to get even. They stole Roscoe's van and trashed it. On May 27th, about a month after the Reynard shooting and a week after stealing the van, Ken was outside a complex on Pierce Street in Pacoima working on his car with a few other people. According to Benny Ward, Ken spotted a car driving by and said, "There goes those N-words I got a beef with." Not long after, G.T. Fisher claimed he saw Stanley Bryant riding around with Andre. G.T. said Stanley nodded toward Ken and pointed him out to Andre, almost like marking a target. Michael Flowers backed up that story. Afterwards, Ken's stepsister, Safina Newsom, saw a Cadillac and a Volkswagen drive slowly near the parking lot. She said Stanley was behind the wheel of the Cadillac. Then the Volkswagen pulled into the lot. Baron Ward then walked up to the car to see if the passenger wanted some weed. But as he approached, the driver suddenly pulled a gun on him. Baron ran, and seconds later he heard several shots. When Baron came back a couple minutes later, he found Ken lying on the ground, dead. About 15 or 20 minutes after the shooting, Baron said he saw a Cadillac drive by and saw a Bryant brother behind the wheel, calling him Jeff. Safina also said she saw Stanley and Jeff drive past the lot after the shooting. Benny said he saw a Bryant brother in a Cadillac, and Rhonda Miller picked Andre out of a lineup, saying he was the guy she saw speeding off in the Volkswagen right after the shots were fired. Both GT and Baron told investigators they were afraid of what might happen to them if they took the stand, and they had every reason to be. At one point, Stanley offered $10,000 to a man named Walter Compton to kill Safina. Jeff even gave him a gun and a getaway car. Walter stalked Safina for days, but couldn't bring himself to do it. Afraid of both the Bryants and going to prison, he turned himself in. Also on March 19, 1985, Clarence Johnson was sitting in Stanley Bryant's pickup truck outside the pool hall when someone rolled up and shot him multiple times. He survived. A man named David Hudnett later pled guilty to the shooting. Initially, he told police that Jeff and Stanley hired him to take Clarence out. He was supposed to testify against the brothers, but after the preliminary hearing, he backed out. He later told police he was worried about retaliation against him and his family. And when he finally took the stand, he changed his story, saying he shot Clarence over a personal issue. About a year after Ken Gentry was killed, his father Charles was also murdered. Investigators started wondering if the 2 murders were connected, so Detective Harley sat down with Andre to dig deeper. During the interview, Andre admitted that Stanley and Jeff had paid him $2,000 to shoot Reynard and another $15,000 to kill Ken. Eventually, all 3 men were hit with charges in connection to those shootings. But the Bryant brothers had deep pockets and powerful influence, and one by one, the witnesses who had originally come forward all started recanting their initial statements, likely after being intimidated. In court, Benny Ward suddenly couldn't remember anything. He said he didn't recall seeing the car or hearing Ken say he had beef with anyone. Instead, he claimed the police fed him that story during questioning. By the time the trial rolled around, Baron also claimed he had no memory of seeing a Bryant brother that day. GT and Michael also took the stand and walked back their earlier statements. Rhonda, who identified Andre in a lineup, was bribed into silence. Before Andre's preliminary hearing, 2 women showed up at her place: Rochelle, Jeff Bryant's ex-girlfriend, and Tanis, who was married to Stanley Bryant at the time. Rochelle handed Rhonda an envelope full of cash and said it was from Jeff. Rhonda didn't want to take the money, but her boyfriend got upset that she refused it, so she eventually accepted the bribe. When it came time for the hearing, Rhonda changed her story and recanted her identification of Andre. But later at trial, she admitted that the recantation was not the truth. Charges against the brothers were dropped, and in the end, Andre was the only one who actually went on trial for the shootings. Andre was convicted of first-degree murder for killing Ken Gentry and assault with a deadly weapon for shooting Reynard Goldman, but his conviction was later reversed on appeal. After that, Andre took a deal and pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and assault with a deadly weapon, and he was sentenced to 9 years behind bars. Back in 1984, Keith Curry got into selling cocaine and also met Tanis Bryant. At the time, Tanis told him she was still married to Stanley but was thinking about leaving him, and by 1985 she followed through. She left Stanley, moved into her own apartment, and Keith started staying over a few nights a week. Then one morning, after spending the night at her place, Keith got into his car, started backing out of the driveway, and boom, a pipe bomb, which was planted underneath his car, exploded. He was lucky to survive, escaping with only minor injuries to his thigh. Despite this, the two stayed together, and they ended up getting married. She ended up taking his name as well. Tanis admitted she remembered the bombing, but denied ever discussing it with Stanley, and said that he never told her he was the one behind it. But Gwendolyn Derby had a different recollection. She said that back in April 1986, Tanis confided in her at Miss Liz's beauty shop, and said that Stanley admitted to planting that bomb under her new boyfriend's car, and that he told her he'd keep trying until Keith was dead. Fast forward to September 28, 1987. Keith was driving down Vanport when he noticed a car behind him flashing its headlights. He pulled over and saw that the driver was Donald Smith. Donald was a member of the Bryant Family organization, and Keith knew him because he was married to Tanis's sister, Elaine. Keith said he never had any issues with Donald. In fact, the conversation started off friendly, and Donald asked him how he was. But out of nowhere, Keith heard 2 gunshots come out from inside Donald's car. He then realized he had been shot in the neck and in the arm. He ended up getting paralyzed. Keith said he never had any beef with anyone and couldn't think of a reason why someone would want him dead. Pierre Marshall knew Keith and was once romantically involved with Rochelle Bryant. After they broke up, he remembered hearing rumors going around that he might be in danger, so he arranged a sit-down with Stanley at a Burger King, just to clear the air. Pierre said that during that sit-down, Stanley twisted his hands around his head and was laughing, saying, "Remember how that N-word got paralyzed?" Pierre said it was obvious that Stanley was talking about Keith. In the early hours of September 29, 1987, California Highway Patrol Sergeant Charles Lofton and his partner, Officer Michael Vandemark, were on patrol when they noticed a white car speeding and swerving between lanes. The car was being driven by Donald. Lofton activated his lights to initiate a traffic stop, and the white car pulled off the freeway and came to a stop. But just as Lofton stepped out of his cruiser, Donald hit the gas and took off, launching into a high-speed chase through the streets of the San Fernando Valley. As the pursuit continued, the officers saw plastic baggies flying out of the car windows, along with what looked like white powder. Donald was also frantically ripping pages out of a notebook and tossing them out the window. The chase lasted nearly 40 minutes before Lofton was able to bump Donald's car from behind, forcing it to a stop. Inside, officers found a .357 revolver and a quarter kilo of crack cocaine, already broken down into 18 baggies. There was also one spent shell casing in the revolver. Donald was arrested, and investigators would later confirm that Keith Curry had been shot at 9:05 p.m. on September 28th, roughly 5 hours before the traffic stop and arrest. Donald was held on a $200,000 bail, and several properties were posted as collateral for bail, including some tied to members of the Bryant Family organization. He was eventually released. While Andre was locked up, the Bryant family still looked out for him. Over the years, they sent thousands of dollars to him and his family. They even helped his friend, James Brown, set up a small cocaine operation out in Monterey. Mona Scott, one of Andre's close friends, got money from the Bryants too, mostly to help cover the cost of Andre's collect calls and to visit him in prison. Francine Smith was also brought in to visit him, and all the expenses were paid by Stanley. But that goodwill had limits. When Francine tried using counterfeit bills to buy drugs at a known Bryant family spot on Louvre Street, things went south. She got beaten up, and Stanley, who happened to be nearby when it happened, told her flat out that if he didn't know her personally, she'd be dead. Angela, Andre's sister, also received about $2,000 from Stanley. However, Andre felt like they hadn't done enough. He believed the Bryants had promised to protect him, to make sure he never got convicted. He considered them weak and felt they failed to honor their promise to him. By mid-July 1988, Andre was paroled from Folsom Prison and temporarily handed over to law enforcement in Missouri. Just 5 days later, he was released from their custody, and he headed straight to his sister's home in St. Louis. Andre was bitter, and he wanted payback. He started telling people, including cops who had interviewed him while he was still locked up, that he was planning to squeeze the Bryants for money and a piece of their drug empire. He figured they'd gone soft, and that now was his chance to take what he felt he was owed. Andrew Greer, a friend of James Brown, had just gotten out of prison himself. Once free, he reconnected with James, who was living in Marina and Monterey, with a woman named Loretha Anderson and her 2 kids, Shamiz and Carlos English. Shamiz was 28 months old, and Carlos was 18 months old. Andre went down to Monterey to meet with James, and the two got to talking about the drug operation James was running, the same one that the Bryants helped him get off the ground. Andre criticized the way James was handling things, saying his whole setup was wrong because he was dealing on a small level, and they should be dealing in bulk. During his time in Monterey, Andre started dating Tanis, Stanley Bryant's ex-wife, and was living with her. Andre and Andrew also got to know each other there. Weeks later, Andre decided it was time to head back to L.A. He told his mom he had some money coming to him and told Andrew that Stanley owed him cash for a past hit and that he was going to L.A. to collect. On Friday, August 26, 1988, Andre and Tanis made their way back to Los Angeles. A few days later, James, Andrew, Loretha, and her 2 kids joined them. Stanley had arranged for them to stay in an apartment in Laurel Canyon, but Andre wasn't happy with it. The place was filthy, and he wanted Stanley to cover the cleaning costs. In the meantime, Andrew, James, Loretha, and the kids checked into the Beverly Garden Hotel in Universal City. Tanis had her own apartment. The next morning, James, Loretha, and Andrew got into a red Volkswagen and drove over to Neighborhood Billiards to look for Stanley. They stuck around for about 20 minutes, and while they were there, someone pulled up in a white Audi and talked with James. It was the same kind of car later connected to Bryant family member Leroy Wheeler. The next morning, on August 28th, Andre, James, and Andrew headed to Tanis's apartment. Andre had already paged Stanley and gotten a call back. He told the group they were supposed to meet up at the Wheeler Avenue house at 4 p.m. to pick up $500 and some cleaning supplies. Before leaving, Andre told Tanis to bring a gun. She slipped a pistol into her purse, and they headed out. They made a quick stop at Tanis's aunt's place, and Andre told her to follow them when they left. But once they got in the car, they noticed Tanis hadn't come out. Instead, she went back inside her aunt's apartment. Andrew noticed and pointed it out, but Andre brushed it off, saying everything was cool. Still, Andrew had a bad feeling and decided not to go. He had them drop him off at the Laurel Canyon apartment instead, where the group was staying. When they got there, Loretha came out onto the porch and mentioned that the kids were hungry. James told her to hop in the car, figuring they'd all grab something to eat afterwards. They all got in and drove off without Andrew. August 28th started off like any other day for James Williams. He clocked in for his usual 90-minute shift at the Bryant family's pool hall. Later that afternoon, Leroy Wheeler came by and gave him a ride to the Wheeler Avenue home. James usually worked 8-hour shifts at that house alongside Leroy and another guy named Lamont Gillen. But that day felt different from the start. Around 2 p.m., Stanley called to say he was coming over. Not long after, he pulled up in a blue Hyundai and parked it inside the garage. As soon as he walked in, he went straight to the back bedroom. At one point, Stanley told James to call Anthony Arsenault, who was supposed to relieve James on the next shift, and tell him not to come in. A little while later, Stanley grabbed the money counting machine and an adding machine, which were normally kept in the house, and took them out to the garage. When he came back in, he was lugging a heavy duffel bag, which he took straight to the back bedroom. Then Leroy and Donald Smith showed up. It was weird. Neither of them was usually there on a Sunday. They didn't say much and went straight into that same back room with Stanley. Stanley kept saying that Johnny is running late. Eventually, another organization member, John Settle, showed up. James had never seen him around before, but just like the others, John headed right to the back. A little while later, a gunshot went off in the back of the house. Stanley came out and casually asked James if he thought the neighbors might have heard the shot. Soon after, James heard the sound of a shotgun being pumped. When he turned around, he saw John holding it, and he then went back into the bedroom. James never asked what was going on because he figured that it was none of his business. Eventually, Stanley, Leroy, and Donald came back out to the living room. Stanley told James that some people were on their way and gave him specific instructions. Stand by the window and let him know when they arrived. Once they stepped into the entryway, the sally port, James was supposed to hit a buzzer in the kitchen to unlock the outer gate. James noticed both Leroy and Donald were now each carrying a gun. Stanley gave James one last instruction. After hitting the buzzer, James was to go out through the garage, hop in a green car which would be parked in the driveway, back it into the garage, and leave the property. He was told to walk to a nearby bus stop and head back to the pool hall, keeping an eye out along the way to see if any of the neighbors were watching what was going on. James later admitted that by that point he had a pretty good idea of what was going on, but he felt like it was too late to say anything. In his own words, he was in too deep, and saying anything could have put him in danger. Not long after, two men James didn't recognize walked up to the house. They stepped into the sally port, and James hit the buzzer, just like he was told. As he was heading to the garage, he heard multiple gunshots and a scream. James then spotted the green car, and as he was getting into it, he saw Leroy outside, holding a shotgun. Leroy walked up to a red Toyota, which was parked at the curb, and then said, "A bitch in the car. Get out of the car, bitch." He then heard the sound of glass shattering. Once the green car was in the garage, James spotted Stanley again, this time inside the garage, who told him to leave immediately. As James made his way to the bus stop, he saw Leroy driving off in the red car that had been parked out front. Stanley left in his own blue Hyundai, and Donald and John took off in the green car that James had just parked. They were all headed in the same direction. Just after 5 p.m. on August 28th, Dwayne James was outside his home on Osborne Street with a friend, Kim James, when a neighbor walked over looking concerned. She said a strange red car was parked in her driveway and asked if they knew anything about it. When they went to check it out, they were hit with a horrifying scene. The back window of the red Toyota, which was seen fleeing from Wheeler Avenue, was smashed out, and inside were 3 people: Loretha Anderson, her daughter Shamise, and her son Carlos. There was blood everywhere. Carlos was the only one still alive, and he was crying when Kim reached into the car and pulled him out. His body was covered in scratches and blood, which was caused by the flying glass. When LAPD arrived, they recovered 3 copper-jacketed rounds from the car, either .38 or .357 caliber, plus a shotgun wadding lying on the floorboard. When officers arrived to the Wheeler Avenue home, the neighbors told them around 5 p.m. they saw a man sprinting down the driveway with a gun in his hands. He ran straight to the red car, which was parked nearby, fired into the passenger side, then circled to the driver's side, shot out the window, jumped in, and sped off. 3 witnesses gave the police descriptions of the men they saw at the crime scene and descriptions of the cars they saw there. One witness told the police that inside the green car there were 4 people, 2 up front and 2 in the back. The passengers in the back looked like they were holding onto and leaning against each other. In the street nearby, police found shattered glass, and when they later compared it to glass from the red car found on Osborne Street, they confirmed that it likely came from that vehicle. Detectives quickly noticed the entire house had been fortified. The front door had a metal grate which led into a small, enclosed porch with a second metal door, creating a kind of trap area that made it hard for anyone to get in or out quickly. The second door led into the home. Investigators found signs that the murders had happened right in the front entrance sally port. There was blood spatter all over the walls, and the front porch had a large pool of blood. The steel security door was flung open, and in the sally port, police found what looked like a large chunk of human scalp, along with several bullet holes, spent casings, and hair. There were also bloody shoe prints and drag marks leading from the front porch through the sally port and all the way to the back of the house near the garage. Inside, bullet fragments, expended shells, and .45 caliber casings were scattered through the living room, hallway, entryway, and kitchen. One .45 casing was found in a trash can. In the bathroom, detectives found a bullet hole in the shower door. In a nearby linen closet, they recovered .00 buckshot pellets. The trajectory of the pellets indicated that the shotgun had been fired in the bathroom, with the pellets going through the shower wall. Scattered around the house were all kinds of documents, 90-minute shift schedules, handwritten notes, ledgers, just like the ones LAPD had seized in earlier raids. There were sheets with names, addresses, phone numbers, and coded scribbles. There was also mail addressed to Jeff Bryant, a note labeled Tommy with a phone number, likely referring to James Brown, who was nicknamed Tommy Hull, and more mail with names like William Settle, who was the organization's bookkeeper, Andrew Settle, a drug dealer within the organization, and Nash Newble, who was a high-ranking member. Then, just 4 days after finding the bodies, on September 1st, Detective Vodtecki followed a lead out to Lopez Canyon, about 5 miles from the Wheeler house. Hidden in some brush just off the roadside, he discovered 2 badly decomposed bodies. The victims were soon identified as Andre Armstrong and James Brown. Andre still had his address book on him, and inside it listed the Wheeler Avenue address, the name Stan Bryant, and several phone numbers tied to known members of the organization. James also had a slip of paper with the same address, along with a number later traced to William Settle. Stanley's contact info showed up again, listed under his home on Judd Street. Firearms expert Anthony Paul determined that at least 3 different shotguns had been fired inside the house, and that the bullets recovered from the red Toyota and from Loretha Anderson's body were all fired from the same handgun, linking those particular rounds to a single shooter. Shamice English had been shot in the back of the neck at close range. The bullet entered near the base of her neck, and based on the wound, the gun was likely fired from less than a foot away. Loretha Anderson's injuries were even more horrific. The medical examiner removed several buckshot pellets from her side, along with 2 bullets from a handgun. The shotgun wound, which was on the right side of her stomach, was fatal, and it came from no more than 4 feet away. Her face and arms showed blast abrasions, marks that come from a shotgun being fired up close. Firearms expert Anthony Paul later reviewed her injuries and concluded that the marks and scarring on her body were consistent with a shotgun being fired through a car window, shattering the glass and turning it into secondary missiles, striking her. Andre Armstrong's body was in bad shape by the time it was found. It had already started decomposing. His eyes were partially destroyed, his face was distorted, and his skin started to mummify. Layers of skin were peeling away, and maggots had already taken over. The advanced decomposition made it hard to see some injuries, but what was visible was a shotgun blast to the side of his head just above the ear, fired at close range. It blew away part of his scalp, and 2 pieces of shotgun wadding were found embedded in his skull. He also had a fatal shotgun wound to the center of his chest, and a bullet wound to his back, likely from a handgun. James Brown had both entrance and exit wounds on his back from a shotgun. There was a contact wound to his chest, with the bullet exiting his back after passing through his heart and lung. The spread of the shotgun pellets suggested the shooter was standing farther away when that shot was fired. Blood found at the Wheeler Avenue house matched both Andre and James, and that chunk of scalp belonged to James. He'd been shot in the head, and the blast had literally torn part of his scalp away. Later after the shootings, Stanley called James Williams and told him not to go back to the house and not to talk to anyone about what just happened. A few days later, William Settle told James that it was about to get hot and that he'd been identified as someone seen at the Wheeler house. He was told to leave town immediately, but was reassured that the family would take care of him and cover his expenses. James then packed up and left L.A., heading back to his hometown of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Before leaving, he called John Settle and arranged for his friend Lamont to pick up $2,000 for him. Once he was settled back home, John sent him another $500. In Harrisburg, James tried to start fresh, but he didn't exactly stay on the straight and narrow. He got a job but ended up stealing money by forging his boss's signature on time cards. On the side, he was also slinging cocaine around the neighborhood. Eventually, he got caught. James was arrested for cocaine possession and having an illegal firearm. While in custody, Harrisburg police gave him the shock of a lifetime. He was wanted in Los Angeles in connection with 6 murders. James insisted he didn't kill anybody, but he was ready to talk. In exchange for immunity, he started naming names and gave investigators several statements about what went down that day. Detectives didn't just have James's word. They had physical evidence to back it up. Fingerprints belonging to both Stanley and Leroy were found inside the Wheeler Avenue house. Stanley's prints showed up on a cordless phone and on a page from an address book, one that listed the alias James Brown had been using, Tommy Hull. Then on September 25th, police searched the home of Leroy's girlfriend. There they found a handgun matching the one used to kill Loretha and her daughter, 2 newspaper clippings about the murders, and nearly $8,000 in cash hidden in the ceiling. Just 4 days later, police raided Stanley's house. Inside, they found items tied to the drug trade, several keys to the Wheeler Avenue property, and documents with contact info for James Brown and relatives of Andre Armstrong. The most damning evidence, though, was a handgun. That gun turned out to be the same one that had fired a .45 caliber casing recovered from a trash can at the crime scene. The day after the murders, both Stanley and Leroy paid a visit to Jeff Bryant, who was still doing time at Donovan State Prison. Just 6 days later, Stanley suddenly traded in his nearly new car, the same one James Williams had seen him driving on the day of the killings. He bought a brand new car, but used one of his employees' names for the paperwork. Keith Seals, the finance manager at the dealership, remembered the deal well. He said 3 men were there for the transaction: Stanley Bryant, Leroy Wheeler, and Antonio Johnson. When investigators got hold of the traded-in vehicle, they ran some tests, and the results showed a presumptive positive for blood near the driver's side floor mat. Not long after, Stanley was overheard telling Liddell Player, a drug dealer the family supplied, that the cops had been poking around Wheeler Avenue because, as he put it, "We had some problems, but we took care of them." He also told another associate, Alonzo Smith, that James Brown had to go. Donald Smith, Leroy Wheeler, Stanley Bryant, and John Settle were all eventually arrested and charged. All 4 men were charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Donald was also facing several other serious accusations, things like conspiracy to commit murder, running a large-scale drug operation, planning to flee prosecution, and trafficking narcotics. Similar charges were also filed against Stanley, Leroy, and John. Tanis Curry and James Williams were also charged with multiple offenses, including murder and attempted murder. And Tanis was also facing drug charges, a fleeing from prosecution charge, and conspiracy charges. They were facing the death penalty. However, both of them were given immunity in exchange for testifying against the others. On October 16, 1991, a fight broke out in the lower TV room at the LA County Jail. Deputy Scott Maas responded to the call and walked into the middle of a full-blown brawl. He saw Donald Smith punching an inmate named Holiday in the face and torso, while a third inmate, Furness, held Holiday in place so he couldn't escape. When officers broke it up, they found Holiday was stabbed 3 times in the back. He also had a busted nose. Not far from where the fight went down, deputies found 2 metal shanks dumped in a toilet nearby. He also got caught twice with shanks, one made from a broken and sharpened CD which was found under his mattress, and one made from a melted plastic cup. Additionally, during a search of Leroy's cell, jail staff discovered a 4-inch homemade shank hidden in his underwear. He ended up pleading guilty to a weapons charge, but that didn't stop him from getting into more trouble behind bars. He assaulted other inmates on 2 different occasions. In one incident, he got into it with another inmate over a card game. Leroy, who had trustee status and was free to move around the tier, argued with the other man, who was locked in his cell. Leroy dumped a bucket of water inside, then told deputies he needed to clean it up. But when they opened the cell door, Leroy rushed in with a shank and started stabbing. When a deputy tried to step in, Leroy swung the blade at him too, slicing the officer's arm. He didn't stop until they threatened him with a taser. The inmate he attacked was left seriously injured and had to be hospitalized for a long time. During trial, prosecutors argued that the Bryant family was running a drug empire, and Jeff Bryant was still considered the overall family leader even while he was behind bars. They argued that the organization put a hit out on Andre Armstrong because he was threatening their drug empire. He used to work for the Bryant organization and had taken the fall for them in an earlier case involving a murder and an assault. When Andre got out and demanded compensation for doing time on their behalf, it sparked a deadly chain of events. To show that Stanley's reasons for wanting Andre dead went beyond just business, prosecutors also used the attacks on Keith Curry, another man who, like Andre, had been involved with Stanley's ex-wife, Tanis. Prosecutors argued that this wasn't just about drugs or money. It was also about jealousy. After Andre and James Brown were killed, prosecutors said Leroy went after the remaining witnesses, all in an attempt to silence anyone who could talk. Donald Smith, Stanley Bryant, and Leroy Wheeler were all sentenced to death. In John Settle's case, the jury couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. 11 jurors wanted to convict, but one held out. Rather than face a retrial, he ended up pleading guilty to 4 counts of voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 21 years and 4 months behind bars. Thank you for watching.